Los Alamos, the hill. Originally home to the Pueblo people and homesteaders, has now become a historic landmark for Project Y, the start of the Manhattan Project. The world's first atomic bombs were built and developed by the Manhattan Project. In 1945, these bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan, instantly killing 60 to 80,000 people. Eventually, these bombs were responsible for killing around 135,000 people, though the exact number of lives lost is unknown. Let's back up, though. Before the bombs were dropped, before the lives were taken, back when the bombs were being constructed and decisions were being made behind the scenes, just before the United States entered World War II, research began for the Manhattan Project. However, the impact was not felt until 1945, when Japan was relentless in war and refused to give up, even after a non-nuclear bombing campaign occurred in Tokyo. The impact of the atomic bomb was not without warning. Albert Einstein expressed concern earlier in the war by writing a letter to U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, stating that Germany was no longer selling uranium and working to develop a bomb with a nuclear chain reaction that could be devastating. Concerned that Germany would develop a nuclear bomb first, Einstein encouraged President Roosevelt to ensure that the U.S. had a stock of uranium, that the president kept an open line of communication with the U.S. physicists working on the atomic bomb, and increase funding for these physicists and their research. Fast forward to 1945, and the Soviet Union declares war on Japan. Tensions that would later turn into the Cold War had began to mount between the Soviet Union and the U.S. at this time. So the declaration was the perfect opportunity for the U.S. to show its vast military strength and drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But first, the bombs had to be built. As a reminder, Los Alamos was once a place where Pueblo people and American settlers resided. But in 1941, the U.S. government had new plans for this area. Through a quick selection process, Los Alamos was chosen as the perfect place for scientists to begin their work. There were already existing buildings, water access, and a sparse population. Rapidly, it became a place that would be home to 6,000 people by 1945. While most people may think of the engineers' rights and responsibilities to the government and the good of the people when they think of Los Alamos, the more interesting aspect of Los Alamos was the rights and responsibilities of the families and to the families, and the thing that, at the end of the day, made this project successful. Families both in and outside Los Alamos were just as impactful as the scientists testing, constructing, and working. The very start of life at Los Alamos was difficult, to say the least. People slept in tents and rarely had homes, and there was definitely some hesitation surrounding living in Los Alamos. Oppenheimer said it himself. The notion of disappearing into the desert for an indeterminate period and under quasi-military auspice disturbed a good many scientists and the families of many more. After all, they lacked many rights everyday citizens had. Nothing in these families' lives was private or secret. Their activity was monitored, their letters were read. They could not escape this constant monitoring, even when they left Los Alamos. In neighboring Santa Fe, there were people assigned to watch the activities of the families. No one could leave Los Alamos without scanning their ID cards. Their cars were searched and torn apart upon entry and exit. There were high fences with barbed wire and armed security guards, and random, unplanned encounters with friends had to be documented.
We took a train to get to Albuquerque, and then we had to ride a bus from Albuquerque to Santa Fe. When we got to Santa Fe, we had to go to this office, and everyone had to get out of the bus. There were other people on the bus, not that many that I recall. They took out all of our luggage, no cameras, nothing like that. No cameras, absolutely no cameras. They went through every piece of luggage that we had. And we showed them our little ID and proceeded into Los Alamos.
Their right to privacy from their government was completely non-existent. It certainly wasn't sunshine and roses hiding a top-secret operation after all. My great-grandparents experienced this firsthand. My great-grandpa was a technician at Los Alamos, and from the perspective of his wife, he was simply working a 9-to-5 government job, and he'd be back at their place in Santa Fe by the evening to eat dinner and play with their baby son. She didn't know her husband was working with deadly amounts of radiation that would kill him 9 years later. She didn't even know why he died of cancer so young, leaving her alone with their then 2 sons. She simply knew she had the responsibility to make sure her son and the house remained in good condition through the day. The honorable, yet exhausting, duty of caretaker. Maybe not playing the biggest role, but playing a role that supported so many others, while being kept in the dark as to why. Workers were sworn to secrecy, and their families rarely knew anything. Some workers didn't even know what they were doing. My grandfather can explain here.
Almost, but his job title was basically truck driver. So he may have been driving truck. I assume it might have been mechanics. I think he worked for like the engineers.
Do you know what he did specifically?
I don't. He was never, when he was alive, he was never allowed to tell us what he did specifically there. And he died before he was ever able to do it.
They simply did what they were told and never knew the true nature of what they were doing in the Manhattan Project. Only the highest officials knew what the Manhattan Project was truly about. But that was their responsibility. This meant the workers and their families' right to knowledge was completely stripped from them. They had to blindly follow whatever they were told to do, never knowing the gravity of what they were doing. This brings up the final question of rights. Did they have the right to kill 135,000 people to end a war? This question doesn't really apply to the lower-level workers' rights that have been talked about earlier, who never knew what they were doing. It's more centered on the higher-ups, the government, the main scientists, the Oppenheimers. On one hand, they killed 135,000 people, or potentially more people. On the other hand, millions had already died from this war, and more would have, especially because of the Soviet Union's proclamation of war. It is quite easy to come to the conclusion that there really is no clear answer. The answer will forever be murky.
Because some of my best friends, they weren't physicists and they weren't scientists. They might have a lesser position, but we were all together in a community that was very, very small, and we relied and we depended on each other for social reasons. So we didn't know what each other did. We know that not everyone was a physicist like Jimmy Bradbury's father, but it didn't make any difference. There were no social lines.
The family's responsibilities to support their Los Alamos workers allowed for the atomic bomb to be developed and detonated. The aftermath of this support was the killing of thousands of innocent people and the ending of World War II. A little less than a month after the first atomic bomb was dropped on Japan, Japanese representatives signed the official surrender. On September 2nd, 1945, the deadliest war in history ended, with the death toll close to 6 million. So did a group of people really have the right to build a device that would kill hundreds of thousands to potentially save millions? Was it their responsibility to save those lives? And the true answer is unknown. There's no alternate universe where we can tell if this was the right decision, if the devastation was worth it in the long run. That's why I ask you, the viewer, to come to your own conclusions. Was it worth it?
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I suppose we all thought that one way or another.